moved, even in prehistoric times, as we'll see next week, but what they brought with them and what they picked up and moved along the way. So today I want to take the story of Marco Polo, whose name in Chinese is Marco Polo, as encapsulating what this year's Society Lectures will be about, and that is the movement of things across Eurasia, Africa, and even the New World, eventually developing into a network of exchange that mirrored growing scientific interest and knowledge about the nature of the globe. So what we'll be looking at actually is mapped out in the history of cartography as well. Marco Polo's reputation as one of the first dependable observers of Asia really continues to inspire those of us who are interested in bridging the persistent gap between East and West, and that's a cause to which I've devoted my whole career. And that includes the contemporary artist, the Chinese artist Sai Guoqiang, whose performance combined with installation piece, bringing to Venice what Marco Polo forgot at the 1995 Venice Biennale, focused on things that were left out of Marco's account, most notably Chinese medicine. However, there is reason to think that Marco was very interested even in that. So the question of what Marco saw and what he missed are things that I want to bring to light today. Beyond the sheer entrancement of Marco Polo's story, and I assume a lot of you have read at least excerpts from his great book, we will find that he was a savvy observer of the world around him, and that his natural talent for both observation and for languages, he was a very gifted linguist, was what he forthrightly claims endeared him to Kublai Khan, the greatest ruler of the 13th and 14th centuries. More than that, I think we have to recognize that Marco was a cultural emissary who brought back news of new things and also of new technologies to Kublai's court. He was, in fact, much more a conveyor of ideas than he was of things. His story shows that even when actual things did not move, descriptions of them did, and artisans skilled in making them did, spurring new industries and trade as much intellectual as material all across Eurasia. We all know that when the elder Marco brothers, Niccolò and Maffeo, set out for the East in 1260, they were really not the first Europeans to do so. The Catholic Church and missionaries like Odoric of Pordenone, William of Rubric, and many others had already made it to the Mongol capital at Karakorum in Mongolia and had lived to write eloquently about it. So accounts existed in some numbers, most of them much more abbreviated than the 400-some page volume that Marco would bequeath to us. After nearly a decade, the Polo brothers returned from Kublai's court to Venice in 1269, and then set out on a second trip to the Great Khanate with Marco in tow. Marco was Niccolò's teenage son, and he was 17 years old at the time. They didn't come home until 1295, and Marco was quickly captured in a sea battle that somehow he joined between Venice and its arch-rival Genoa in 1296. He was imprisoned. Probably this is a word that doesn't reflect his actual conditions of living. He probably was quite luxuriously accommodated during the period, together with another man whose name was Rustichello da Pisa. And you see a later engraving of the two of them side by side, with Marco telling his story to Rustichello, who is now committing it to writing. Rustichello we don't know very much about, but apparently he was a storyteller and he had some talent as a poet, rather modest, judging by the result in the book. But he had great energy and incredible curiosity, and he was the man that Marco entrusted his tale to. And when Rustichello wrote it down, he cast the account as a kind of gallant tale in the tradition of knightly, chivalric oral romances that were common during his day. And the original story was actually written in a kind of Franco-Italian, so it wasn't in Latin, it was rapidly translated into Latin. But this was a period when writers were beginning to be interested in using vernacular languages as a way of telling stories to larger groups of people. And very quickly, the story, which existed in manuscript form for a long time before the advent of printing, was translated into Latin and French and Spanish and Italian eventually, and eventually into every language in the world. So there are copies of it in Chinese and Japanese, for example. Now, what's interesting about this book is that there is no text. That is, there's no text that we can point to say that it was fundamentally the story that Marco dictated to Rustichello. Instead, what happened was that as the story spread out around the world in manuscript form, those copyists who were committed to writing it down again and even illustrating it felt that Marco had left things out or that things needed explanation. So it began to be embroidered really quite dramatically. And so we now have this very elaborate stemma, as codicologists would call it, that is the descent of the text from what they believe was originally a rather spare text dictated by Marco to Rustichello, and something that became a lot grander. And there is a marvelous translation by the scholar A.W. Moule that actually, in the English, gives us in italics exactly what was added. So he did this very dramatic reconstruction of the text that enables us to see how it grew and how it was changed over time. Now, what we know about the text, though, is that for certain it was not a merchant's diary. Marco is interested in things, and he's constantly mentioning products, but he doesn't really talk about prices, for example, or quantities of supply, or anything that we would really expect from a merchant's diary. Nor is it a travelogue. As I'll show you as we go through one of the illuminated manuscripts of it, you'll see that it really is something different. It starts out with a very brief discussion of the brothers' trip to the Great Khanate and Marco's subsequent trip and their return. But what it then does is open up to a detailed cultural geography in which Marco really struggles to make sense of the lands through which he had traveled in terms that approach an ethnographic and cultural geography, what geographers call a chorography. So there's a very special name for this kind of geography that really focuses on the customs and cultures of the lands through which he traveled. So he wasn't so interested in how this would be mapped out on the ground, as a kind of there was no latitude during that period of time at all, but only longitude. So the difficulty of getting this on a map was not something he was particularly concerned with. So in a sense, it just reads as a sense of what might have been next to what, and not always that. Now, despite its semi-poetic form and its self-reflexive and often teasing withholding of information until later, and this is a trope we'll see that Marco uses a lot, the book is really rather objective in tone. And despite its regular exaggerations of scale and Polo's infatuation with the number 12,000, which he used it kind of the way that Chinese used the term wan, 10,000. So everything is 12,000 with him. If it were 100, it's suddenly 12,000. So he does tend to exaggerate, and the inflation of his own role and his father's and uncle's role in the estimation of the Great Khan. Really, the book is quite accurate when we get down to it. Now, I know that some of you will be harboring the suspicion that the book that Marco Polo produced and dictating to Rustichello was a fabrication, that he never went to Asia at all, but rather that he simply collected material from travelers who came to Venice or Constantinople, where he traded for some period of his life, and that he collated that, mostly material probably coming from the Islamic world. After all, Marco never mentioned some of the most obvious things about Chinese culture. For example, he never mentions chopsticks. He never mentions foot binding. He doesn't even mention the peculiarities of the writing system. He doesn't mention woodblock printing except in the most limited sense, and so on. So this view, the view that Marco's book is actually a fiction, was put forward some years ago by the British scholar Francis Yates, and it caused a sensation. It was talked about in the New York Times and Time magazine. It was everywhere. It has been substantially undermined, however, in more recent years by the publication of materials in Chinese and Arabic that actually corroborate some of Marco's more dubious statements and even hint at the Polo's presence in China and in the Ilk Khanate, that is the part of the Great Mongol Empire further to the west. In the end, though, the Polos are really curiously absent from records in Chinese. Their names don't really appear as agents in the multilingual records of that great empire. And in fact, they're only there in the new evidence by a kind of circumstantial evidence that's presented. Because of the curious mix-up of names, moreover, between Marco Polo and another very prominent figure, which I will get to at the end of this talk, there is, and this was something that wasn't discovered until quite recently, their absence wasn't really discovered in texts until the 19th century, when people began to realize, oh, this person referred to as someone else, in fact. So this question of the claims and counterclaims about the account being fictional were put forward at that time. But more about that later. Marco's silence on some of the characteristic markers of Chinese culture, I think we can now understand to reflect his limited experience in China proper. And by that I mean the regions to the south of the Yangtze River that constituted the old southern Song Empire, and that he calls Manji. So he divides what we now know of as China into two areas. The northern part he calls Cathay, and or after Kitai, and then the southern part he calls Manji. So this Manji, his descriptions of Manji are really cursory at best, and except for his very rich evocations of a place called Kinsei, the old southern Song capital at Hangzhou. So to think about the Polos and their lives in the period of the late 13th and early 14th centuries, we have to recognize that they witnessed a moment during which the Catholic Church in Europe experienced nearly fatal disagreements about papal succession, which divided Europe. And it was the same period when the Mongols and their empire, conceived and built by Chinggis Khan, the founder, and his successors, rapidly expanded, of course, from Mongolia all the way across Asia to the very borders of Europe, to the Danube. Taken together, the Polos were in Asia, actually, for much of the period from their first trip in 1260 through their final return in 1295. So this is like a period of 35 years, a very long time. And they were on the road, a very treacherous road, it seems, for quite a few years coming and going. Now, here's what happened to Asia during that period. I found this map, and it's a little blurry, but I think you can sort of see. Here are the Mongols getting bigger, and then dividing. So we can go through that again, starting in Mongolia. And notice how long it takes them to take southern China. It's quite late, actually. So it's during the period when the Polos were in this area that they managed to accomplish that. Here's a map that shows the Mongol Empire at its height, when it was broken down into 5 separate khanates. Oh wait, we're looking here at the succession from Chinggis. Chinggis Khan at the bottom with his sons Tochi, Chagatai, and Ogadai, and then Tolui, who gives birth to the sublineage that gives us Kublai Khan, who is the great Khan that Marco Polo is associated with. And you see the Khans of the Golden Horde, Batu, Berkeley, and Guyuk in the center. So on the map, this division looks like this, with the empire of the Great Khan at the very far east, controlled by Kublai Khan, the Chagatai Khanate in the middle, the White Horde and Golden Horde up at the top, and the Ilk Khanate located in what is now Iran, Iraq, and moving into the Fertile Crescent and the Holy Land of Christianity. So this was a moment of massive transformation of the map of Eurasia. and a time when the rulers of this region were engaged in not just warfare with each other, but also attempts at diplomatic exchange. So if this sounds familiar, things never really change, with some people preferring this approach to dealing with conflict or potential conflict. Here we see a letter from Arghun, who was the Ilkh Khan, as you see in the very late part of the 13th century, and the son of Abaka Khan, who we will later find was married to a Byzantine woman who came to be known as Mary of the Mongols, and the grandson of Hulagu, who was Chinggis Khan's grandson. And he writes this letter to Philip the Fair of France in 1289. It was written in Turkish, the Turkish language, and very often these letters were written in either Turkish or Persian. Persian actually was the lingua franca of the realm, the Mongol realm, the language that everybody understood. And it seems that Marco was actually quite fluent in it, as well as being fluent in Mongolian by the time he reached this region. So this diplomatic aspect of what was going on in the Mongol Empire is something extremely important to understanding Marco's account. He was part of the diplomatic exchange. He was part of the efforts to gather information for the Khan and to bring it back from parts of the world as far away as in India. So these sides of the conversation between the Mongols and others included the exchange of very rich gifts, obviously, many of which are recorded in Chinese records, also in papal and royal inventories in Europe, and paintings. And all of this was documented really beautifully by Lauren Arnold in her wonderful exhibition and catalog, Papal Treasures and Princely Gifts, in the 1990s. The Polos were part of this exchange, as I say, and Marco's book did a lot, I think, in Europe to demythologize the Mongols, whom Europe, really, which was still locked in this kind of crusader mentality, viewed in terms of, really, they saw the Mongols as the forces of Armageddon, or as Gog and Magog, using these dreadful biblical images to bring forth the notion that a group of monstrous beings were poised at the edge of Europe and that they literally were going to signal the end of the world, or more optimistically, the second coming of Christ. So a lot of them really concentrated on that aspect. So we see when Marco writes his book, we're in the middle of a world that's about to explode, it seems, and only the careful efforts of letter writing and carrying along a very well-developed post road developed by the Mongols keeps things at bay, it seems. So let's turn to the book. There are several surviving early 15th century manuscripts of Marco Polo's book, as well as other accounts of travel to the east. One of these other accounts, which is titled Le Livre des Grands Khans, or the Book of the Great Khan, is in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. And as you see here, it has a beautiful opening illustration of a common starting point for journeys eastward, that is Venice, where you can see in this illustration the famous lions of San Marco arrayed on pillars in the plaza before the cathedral, one of the very great sites of this center of trade. So this is a very famous book. It is not Marco Polo's account, however. The most discussed and most complete illuminated and illustrated version of Marco's account is a volume with several different texts about Asia, all bound together as Bibliothèque Nationale de France 2810. So it's a very famous manuscript, and here you can see the volume here. And I'm showing you this because it's available online as a website, so I've given you the URL on your handout. If you want to go, you can leaf through this book all the way through Marco's account and all the other accounts that are included there. And it's really wonderful. You can download anything from it. It's a little tricky, but you can do so, and I've downloaded a lot that I'm going to show you today. So these things are bound together as Le Livre des Merveilles du Monde, or the Book of Wonders of the World. This is one of the major titles that was used in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, for Marco's book. The volume includes 265 miniature illustrations that measure approximately 160 to 170 millimeters across. So they're very small. It's like less than 5 inches. So they're going to be small, but we're going to see them blown up on the screen. So keep in mind that what you're seeing is something that actually is tiny. Taken together, I think these texts, of which there are about a half a dozen, as well as some translated letters that passed between the rulers of the Mongol Empire and their counterparts in Europe, this volume must have been the most authoritative statement on Asian geography, history, and culture in Europe at the time. Much of what is shown in Marco's account in this version reflects observed facts that were filtered through distinctly 15th century French eyes. So everything's going to look very French as we go forward, and we're going to have to try to think what that means. Now, consider, for example, this image, which was included in Marco's text as an illustration of a group of monstrous figures that the book seems to imply that he encountered, showing these famous monsters of Central Asia known as the Blemy, the Cyclops, and the Sciopod. In fact, Marco doesn't talk about these at all in his book, not in any version, and the image is just placed there because presumably the artists and the planners of this volume felt that this omission on his part, that his failure to mention the Blemy, the Sciopod, and the Cyclops, eroded his credibility. So it's an incredibly funny thing. So they just stuck it in to say, well, it should be here. And they put it in a very odd place in the book, too. Now, this volume was presented, it was actually commissioned and then presented by the very famous figure Jean Sans Peur, or John the Fearless, in 1413 to his uncle Jean de Berry. And we see Jean Sans Peur here in the red robe with a black hat and black covering on his neck. His very distinctive profile. He was portrayed a lot. This is clearly him, but he's been placed into a figure that is meant to represent Pope Clement V as he receives a communique from the Mongol Khan. So Jean Sans Peur is doing a little bit of self-advertising here, obviously, by doing this. Everybody would have recognized his profile. The illustration accompanies the text of an Armenian prince named Hayton, which is bound in this same volume and entitled Fleur des Histoires de la Terre d'Orient, or the flower of tales of the lands of the Orient. So lots of these things were being written at this point. And it was bound together with Marco's text. Now, Marco begins his account, as I mentioned to you before, by laying out its bare bones, describing the initial trip of his father Niccolo and Maffeo, his uncle Maffeo, who were merchants of Venice, and who, following their grandfather, had spent a considerable time trading in Constantinople. So this is where the book begins in terms of its illustration here. And then goes on to describe their arrival in Mongol territory, their return as emissaries of Kublai, their second trip to the Great Khanate, this time with Marco in tow, and the Polo's final departure on another charge from Kublai to the Ilk Khanate, and ultimately their return home to Venice. Now, in the very first illustration, which you see here, Niccolo and Maffeo are taking leave of the Byzantine Emperor Baldwin III in Constantinople, and they're about to depart for Armenia. As you can see, everything in this illustration looks extremely French, not just the architecture, which seems to fulfill all of our dreams of medieval architecture, and is pink in color, suggesting it's built out of sandstone, but also the figures who are in the courtly poses of that are very typical from French illuminations of very different sorts of subjects. So essentially, what's happening here is that the artists who've never been to Constantinople are being provoked by a text to imagine what it might have looked like at this moment of departure based on a very brief description in the text. Immediately after their departure, actually from Constantinople and on their way into Armenia, the brothers, Niccolo and Maffeo, stumbled into one of the hugest conflicts underway in the Mongol world, and that was the rivalry between the Ilk Khans led by Hulegu and the Golden Horde led by Berkeley. So they were stymied. They really couldn't go forward because there was war all around them. So this sense of them being stuck constantly because of conflict is something that comes across really clearly in the text. We see here that the brothers have encountered Berkeley Khan. This is the moment when they encounter Berkeley Khan. They come to his camp, and he who will very quickly be defeated by Hulegu, the Ilk Khan. And they are fortunate enough to meet an old and wise messenger, as Marco describes him, from Hulegu, who agrees to let them come with him to meet Kublai Khan. So now they've got protection because they're on the road with somebody who's been granted immunity from being tampered with by Hulegu. The lengthy trip to Kublai's capital at Khanbalik, which is Dadu or modern Beijing in this same space that modern Beijing now occupies, is actually markedly compressed in this part of the text. There isn't a lot of amplification of it at all. It's reserved for telling later. And again, this deferral until later is a constant trope in Marco's tale. He's just got so much to say, he needs to lay out his summary first. The brothers arrive at the court, and they are very warmly greeted. And again, you can see that Khanbalik, or Dadu, the great Khan's capital, is depicted as now it's starting to look like maybe there's some elements of Central Asian architecture because we've got these domes happening, so we've pushed it a little further to the east, but it's still pink, which seems to suggest kind of sandstone construction, something that we will see characteristic throughout. So after this trip, they're very warmly greeted because Kublai apparently has never met any Latins, according to Marco, and he's been dying to meet them, wanted to meet some Latins, and is very happy to welcome them into his company, immediately providing a great feast for them and so on. After staying a while with Kublai, actually a number of years, the brothers were charged with a mission by him. Kublai asks them to accompany a baron whose name is Kogatal, or Kogatai more likely in Mongolian, with a letter to the Pope and a request for, among other things, oil from the lamp in the holy sepulchre of Jesus Christ in Jerusalem. So this is a really distinct mission. He also provides a letter to the Pope asking him to send 100 wise men of learning in the Christian religion and in their doctrine, who also should be very well versed in the 7 arts. So he somehow heard about these classical arts of the West, and he wants his people to learn them. So the Polos have this charge going forward. In order to have them accomplish this, he provides them, as you see here, with a gold paidza. That is an order that secures their safe passage. And this is an important part of Mongol success, actually. These paidza that enabled their messengers to move safely across vast territories with the assurance that they would get fresh horses, that they would be fed, that they would be provided with lodging and clothing, because these trips were so long and they could take years. So Marco makes a lot of this paidza and its efficacy throughout the book. He's constantly talking about the granting of paidza, recognizing that the importance of this safe passage. Lots of these survive, actually, and you can see that the 2 on the left are more like the one that seems to have been presented to the or is being presented to the brothers in the manuscript. The other is a rounder one that looks like it could be dangled from the waist, but what they both share is inscription in Pugpa script. This is the square script that was invented by Pugpa Lama, who came to be the guru, actually, of Kublai Khan, and who was the first to initiate him into Tibetan-style Buddhist practice. So Pugpa script it's capable of, you can use it to, it's a syllabary, so you can use it to write any language. And one of the hard things about reading these inscriptions is first to figure out what language they're written in, so that you can understand how the transcription works. But this was part of this sense of universality. How do you create a universal language that would be suitable and readable across an entire empire? Now, with this paidza in hand, the brothers safely make it all the way to Acre, which here you see on the map is about halfway down between Antioch and Jerusalem, a very important crusader city. For those of you who visited there, there's still a great fortress that you can see. And here they are greeted at Acre, only to learn that the Pope has passed away. They have nobody to deliver the letter to. And beyond that, there has been a very grave difficulty among the cardinals to come to any sort of decision about who the new Pope should be. So the Polo brothers are stymied at this point, and they are told by a visiting bishop that it would probably be best if they just returned to Venice and waited for a new pope to be elected, because nobody else had the right to send them forward. So the pope was Clement IV. He actually died in the year 1268, and this helps us place the arrival of the Polo brothers in Acre and their eventual departure to Venice. Now, it wasn't until 1271 that a new pope was elected. He was Gregory X, and it turns out he, of course, was the very bishop that the brothers bumped into in Acre. And so he was already well disposed to their mission. He gave them permission to gather oil from the Holy Sepulchre's lamp. He wrote a letter and sent a group of monks to accompany the brothers back. They unfortunately never made it, giving up along the way. But what happened was that the Marco brothers returned to Venice, picked up 17-year-old Marco, and took him along. So now we've got this young boy. You can imagine this sort of fungible brain, you know. He can pick up languages. And along the way, by the time he arrives in Mongolia, he's already totally conversant in Mongolian and other Central Asian languages. We assume probably also Persian and probably some Arabic. And when they arrive, they present, here you see them leaving or presenting the Kublai's letter to the Pope, the new Pope, Gregory X, and here delivering the Pope's response to Kublai. Kublai was really pleased with Marco when he met him, and he immediately sent him on a reconnaissance mission to Yunnan province, to probably Dali, so very close to the Tibetan border, which Marco also claimed to visit a little further into his book. So this was really the first of a series of fact-finding missions that Marco claims he performed for Kublai Khan. For more than 20 years in the Great Khanate, the Polos, after more than 20 years in the Great Khanate, the Polos begged permission to return, but the Khan refused, citing his deep affection for them. And this is something Marco pumps a lot, is how much the Khan loved them, you know, all the things he did for them, how generous he was, how he couldn't be without them. And so he puts these words into Kublai's mouth. The Khan offers them huge rewards of gold and other things if they agree to stay. But the Polos are very worried that Kublai has reached the end of his life, and they're worried about what will happen to them as a new Khan succeeds. And so they keep requesting permission to leave. So at this point in the tale, and it's very close to the beginning, is inserted the story of the lady Kokujin, who was a Mongol lady requested as a replacement wife for the Ilk Khan's deceased wife, Bolgana, who is known in Western romances as Zibelline. You may have heard this name. We'll return to this story later, because that's what Marco does as well. But I will show you in a manuscript from, here we have them begging permission to return home. And here in a number of versions of a manuscript by Rashid al-Din Hamadani, the Jami al-Tawarik, which we'll talk about later too, or Compendium of Chronicles, we can see the Ilkhan Ghazan with his wife, the lady Kokujin. So she becomes a real figure of symbolizing the exchange between these two parts of the empire. Now, with the synopsis of their travels complete, Marco returns to the details as promised. So now he's told you over and over again, I'll tell you about this later. Well, now he does. And he goes on for 350 pages outlining everything of interest that he saw in what is, as I mentioned, essentially a cultural geography of Central Asia. The Great Khan's northern capitals, and to a lesser extent, South China. Also, a history of the founding of the Mongol Empire by Chinggis Khan, as well as some of the more scandalous acts of treachery that the Mongols encountered after Chinggis's death in this succession conflict that they had. Marco also provides descriptions of Tibet, Burma, Bengal, Java, Sumatra, India, Madagascar, and points west. All this on the way to, and on the way to Kambala, Kublai's capital, Marco takes notes of amazing wonders, hence the title of the volume is Le Livre des Merveilles du Monde, the Book of Wonders of the World. These were things that had never, ever been encountered in Europe, and he is at pains to try to describe them, stretching the limits of the language he has at his possession to do so. So, for example, in sites that he saw that are not illustrated in this particular book, he talks about the city of Saba in Persia, where the three magi originated, and actually he gives us a picture of the magi, which seems perfectly normal, I think, to Western viewers' eyes. Why? Because medieval illustrators and artists were well aware of what the three magi should look like. And so here we have a normal-looking picture with architecture that seems to echo something about the Holy Land, something that they had come to grips with in their practice long before. So he also talks about, he apparently coming to the city of Saba, he asks everyone for information about the three magi, but nobody knows anything about them. Why? Because the city was completely decimated, Marco says, when the Mongols went through and conquered it. So no one is left who possesses any cultural knowledge at all. And this is very interesting because I think it may have spurred some of Marco's desire to recapture whatever tidbits he could. He sees in part his mission as a kind of mission of recovery and reconstruction. So this is a fascinating passage, actually. He also talks about the 8 kingdoms of Persia, Persia by now being divided into these sub-khanates, where fabrics of silk and gold were made, and specifically of the city of Zazdi, where he says silks of the same name, silks called Zazdi, were made. He talks about Kremen, a place also in this region, which was a source of metals, of weaponry, of armor, and beautiful embroidered silk, and also a very special falcons, which would have endeared them to Kublai Khan, who was very interested in the art of hunting with falcons. He talks about a place called Balassiam in Afghanistan, where rubies are mined. And he also tells us numerous tales from this region that survived and which he gathered up. One of the most interesting of them, I think, has to do with the old man of the mountains, who, of course, was the head of this cult of the assassins that's extremely well known from this region, who apparently used a soporific drink to lure young men into this terroristic cult he operated. He would give them this drink, and then have them carried into this beautiful garden, which was described by Marco as looking a lot like paradise. And there they would sleep and dream as though they were in paradise and awaken to this beautiful spot, and then never want to leave. But in order to stay, they were forced to go out and kill the old man's enemies. So thus he lured them in with hallucinogenics, presumably. It's like the typical downward spiral, right, that we hear about all the time. And he then sends them out to be part of this terror cult that he's organized. So that's a very interesting story. The tales of this old man of the mountain were very well known in Europe, and he substantiates the location of it. He also describes asbestos, which he calls by its then European name salamander. Salamander, as far as the Europeans were concerned, was something that actually was made of the hair of a beast that lived on fire, and hence it prevented things from burning. So Marco is very quick to disabuse his audience of this notion of what salamander or asbestos is. He says instead, on information that he gets from a local man who was in charge of mining asbestos in this region, that it comes from the earth. And he provides a very close description of how it's made and how napkins of it can be thrown in the fire for cleaning. So, rather than having to launder them, you just throw them in the fire and everything's burnt off. But Marco also says, and I think this is extremely interesting, that a large asbestos napkin was taken to Rome by Niccolo and Maffeo Polo on their first trip back, and the Holy Shroud of Christ, the so-called Shroud of Turin, was wrapped in it. And the salamander or asbestos towel was inscribed You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. So this is like a little tidbit he's got there. It's just kind of wonderful to think about what people were worrying about. As you know, in Europe at this time, the relics trade was just going crazy. There were lots of forgeries of the Shroud of Christ and so on that were being marketed to anyone. And the Byzantine Empire was selling off all of the relics it had in order to shore up its failing economy. So relics, this issue of relics was a major issue in how they should be protected. Now, some of the illustrations in Marco Polo's Book of Wonders, I think really speak very eloquently, as I've said already, to the difficulty that French artists working for Jean Sans Peur experienced as they tried to visualize things in places they'd never seen. So what we're looking at here is, I think, the classic art historical problem of ekphrasis, as we call it, that is, using words to describe a visual object. No matter how many words you use, as Confucius is purported to have said, although he never did, a picture is worth 1,000 words, it's obviously never enough to enable a perfect transmission of something that somebody else has seen. So this is a critical issue of how much Marco would have needed to say to be able to rip the artists who followed him out of this state of mind, you know, that made them search in their own neighborhoods for things that they could see as equivalents, or I think in this case, false equivalents. So in this particular section of the text, we're looking at a glaring example of that, where Marco is describing a ritual celebration of the Tangut people, who of course lived in what is now Gansu province and were conquered by Chinggis Khan in 1225. Immediately after that, Chinggis died, and the empire was subsequently expanded by his sons. But Marco spends a lot of time talking about the Tanguts because he finds their rituals and ceremonies to be extremely interesting. He calls them, as he does all Buddhists, idolaters. So when we see the term idolater, we know it means somebody who worships idols and therefore Buddhists, and that these idolaters offered 2 sheep a year to their local temple to celebrate the birth of a child. So here we're looking at this happening, and we're keyed into the fact, you see the gentleman is holding 1 sheep in a basket, and there's another little sheep who's looking on with interest at this gentleman in the red robe who's got a bell at his waist, as you can see. And on a pedestal, there is a figure of a deity in a very elegant classical position. In fact, obviously the French artist is attempting to render something that may have come from Tantric Buddhism, and has no clue about how to do it, even though later in the text Marco is very clear about what these deities looked like, saying that many of them were women, many of them had animal heads, many of them had 4, 6, 8, 12 arms, etc. But instead of connecting these 2 passages, what the French artists have done seems to have gone to their neighborhood. Here is an example of Sylvan, a Roman sculpture of the 3rd century from the Temple of Diana in Neem, which was visible during this period. It's not an excavated temple, it's been there standing. And you can see the pose and the kind of misunderstanding of what looks like just a rock support for the figure of Sylvan has here been rendered as something that looks kind of like a shield. We have other illustrations of Buddhist deities in this volume as well, not from Marco's text, but rather, as you see here, from a text that is the Voyages of William of Mandeville. This was a totally fictional text, but during this period, nobody thought it was fictional. It really is a novel, but it incorporated material from the reports of lots of travelers. And in this section, we see the Mongols worshiping animal-headed deities. And now the heads look like, yeah, well, maybe we could say they look kind of tantric, but the poses and figures and the use of the pedestal, the shield-like object that's down below, again, all seems to reflect what we know about how marble sculpture was carved. And we can compare this, I think, also to a very famous work that you all know, this Vajra by Raava Mandala, dating to 1328 to 29, that's in the Metropolitan Museum. Now I'm just focusing on the center of it, where we have Vajra by Raava, who has got a bull head, as you see, lots of arms, 24 to be exact, and so fits, very well, I think, into the description that Marco provides. Marco also spends a lot of time talking about the founding of the Mongol Empire under Chinggis Khan, and here's an illustration that shows his coronation. Again, it's done in a mode that suggests what medieval coronations of kings might have been like. And throughout now, I think you'll begin to see the Mongols are distinguished from others quite clearly by the hats that they wear. A kind of a pointed hat that has a rather wide brim around it that turns up at the edges. And this is a characteristic ethnic marker that the French artists have decided to include, and they use it as a kind of code throughout the book to suggest who's Mongol and who isn't. So aside from talking about Chinggis Khan, Marco also talks a lot about a man of great interest in Europe, that is Prester John, whose name suggests that he was a prester, a member of the Catholic Church, and of course was of great interest because it suggested to the popes that the Mongols were Christians. And in fact, a lot of them were. A lot of the women in particular, but not just women, were Nestorian Christians, as many of you already know. And the popes hoped that they could be moved along from what he considered to be this primitive form of Christianity to the more the truer doctrine of the Catholic Church. So this interest in Prester John, whether he actually existed or not, what his relationship to Chinggis Khan was, all of these things Marco deals with in great detail. Now, after going through all of this, Marco finally takes us to the summer capital of the Khan, that is Shangdu, or what we know as Xanadu. He describes his term for it as Xiandu, and you can see how this Xiandu would easily convert to Xanadu as it was written over and over and over again. This is an aerial view of the site of Xanadu, or Shangdu, the upper capital of the Mongols, which no longer exists. It was completely destroyed, but there's enough to see just in the foundational remains so that you get a sense of a very extensive city surrounded by a large wall with two inner walls with lots of building foundations remaining as well. Marco describes this city of Shangdu, or his Xiandu, as a vast palace of marble, cunningly worked. The halls and rooms and passages are all gilded, wonderfully painted within with pictures and images of beasts and birds and trees and flowers and many kinds of things. He also tells us that the city was surrounded by 16 miles of plain land in circuits. So it literally is in the middle of this steppe sort of region and could spread out in all directions. Marco also describes what he calls the cane palace of Kublai. So we see Kublai's got a marble palace, but he also has a cane palace, and this seems to refer to, of course, the Gars or Yurts that the Mongols lived in and loved to continue to live in the summer in particular. And Marco describes this palace by saying, in the middle place of that park, thus surrounded with a wall, where there is a most beautiful grove, the great Khan has made for his dwelling a great palace or loggia, which is all of canes, upon beautiful pillars gilded and varnished. And on the top of each pillar is a great dragon, all gilded, which winds the tail around the pillar and holds up the ceiling with its head and stretches out the arms. That is one to the right hand for the support of the ceiling, and the other in the same way to the left. But it is all gilded inside and out, and worked and painted with beasts and with birds very cunningly worked. The roof of this palace is also of canes, gilded and varnished so well and so thickly that no water can hurt it, and the paintings can never be washed out. And it is the most wonderful thing in the world to be understood by one who has not seen it. And there follows after this a description of how the canes, made of bamboo in this particular case, were prepared and attached, how the roof was constructed, how it's portable, how the ropes that are used to bind the canes together are made of silk, and how the Khan stayed there for 3 months of the year, from June to August, moving also on some occasions to his marble palace. Now, we are at pains, I think, to try to imagine what this Ger or yurt might have looked like and how big it was. There was an effort a number of years ago in Mongolia to reconstruct the grand yurt of Ugade, who was a Khan who preceded Kublai. in Mongolia. That's since been taken down, and it seems as though it's actually been expunged from the internet because I couldn't find any pictures of it. However, I did find the Gare that's now claimed to be the biggest Gare in the world in Turkmenistan, which you see is huge. And these structures, in fact, are, because of the nature of the structure, are capable of getting very, very, very big. And they can be very elaborately decorated inside as well. So I have no doubt that the Turkomans who built this yurt probably consulted Marco Polo to get details about how it should be designed. We also know that Marco spent a lot of time with Kublai Khan as he hunted, and so he's extremely interested in the hunt, as people all across Europe were, as well as in Asia. And he tells us that the Khan keeps all sorts of not fierce, wild beasts, which can be named there, and in very great numbers, and that is harts and bucks and roe deer, to give to the Falcons to eat, and to the falcons, which he keeps in mew in that place, which are more than 200 Falcons without the falcons. So that's a lot of birds, hunting birds. And the great Khan often goes riding through this park, which is surrounded with a wall, and takes with him one tame leopard or more on the crupper of his horse. And when he wishes, he lets it go and takes one of the aforesaid animals and has them given to the falcons or Falcons. He doesn't eat them himself because it's summertime, and Mongols are not eating meat at this time of year. So we learned that these animals were all marvelously trained, and that these hunts could be very elaborate, including this illustration here of a hunt on where the litter of the Khan Kublai is now on the back of animals, big elephants who are shown with very elegant mounts on their backs of textiles. Now, I think this is an incredibly interesting description of the hunt, but it seems to vary in a certain degree from the way we see the hunt represented in the court itself by, for example, the artist Liu Guandao, who was a Chinese artist who worked for Kublai Khan and produced this painting of Kublai and Chabi, the empress of Kublai, hunting in the year 1280. So this is right during the period when the polos are there, actually. And this is in the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. And you can see the beautiful evocation of Kublai with his moon-like face, and Chabi with her face as round as a moon. Also on their beautiful horses, Kublai's got an ermine robe on. He's dressed, as is everyone else, in robes of silk that are brocaded with gold, something that Marco spends a great deal of time describing. He also tells us about Kambalik, that is Dadu, spends a great deal of time describing this great palace and describing the double palaces of Kublai and his heir apparent, which you see depicted here. So they were supposedly identical, and you see Kublai with his son, and the two of them with their identical palaces on horseback heading in two different directions outside of Kambalik. Marco spends a lot of time talking about how many foreigners came and went in Kambalik, that this was a city that was full of foreigners, and that not only were there thousands of foreigners pouring in and out, but there were also tens of thousands of prostitutes who were there to serve the foreigners, all of them kept outside the city. He discusses the rich and strange things that came into the city from all parts of the world. Pearls and gems from India, more than 10,000 carts of silk and cloth of gold each day. And also tells us markedly, and this is extremely important, that cloths of gold and silk were made there. So we get a sense of this cloth of gold, which he mentions continually as both coming into the capital as trade matter and also being made in the vicinity. Now, what this capital actually looked like, again, we need to turn to Chinese painting, I think, to get a sense of it. This is a painting, anonymous work in the Nelson Atkins Gallery, long claimed to be the Zhao Yu's pacification of the southern barbarians, but which actually now has been reassigned to the Yuan dynasty, so putting it right in the middle of Kublai's period, that is understood to be a hand scroll that gives us the 10 stages in the career of an official of the court. And what it gives us is a view of the Zhongtian Gate of Kambalik. So here you get a sense of the massiveness of this. And just consider, how quickly these cities were built, how rapidly they went up, how substantial they were. This was no mean feat of construction here, not by any means. Here you can see in this site plan how large the city was, and in terms of its plan, it follows that of the upper capital at Shangdu or Xanadu as well. Very large and quite similar in layout and its use of waterways and artificial lakes to what eventually would be the Ming and Qing capital in Beijing. Now, before we break, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of the elements of the court that Marco seems to find most fascinating. And this has to do with the color coding of clothing during this period of time. We know from his text that on the New Year's Day, for example, the Khan and all his subjects dressed in white. And they did so because they considered the color of white to be auspicious. So they wanted to begin the new year in this way. And that lots of presents were given to everyone, that 5,000 elephants were covered with beautiful cloths worked artificially and richly in gold, et cetera, and the camels likewise were covered in white silk. So white was the color for this holiday. And we can see, I think, a kind of insistence on a kind of a sense of one color most often in the way the Mongols had themselves depicted. So, for example, while we have the white-headed, white-robed ladies for New Year's, as we can assume from Le Livre des Merveilles or the Book of Wonders. Here we see Chabi, the empress of Kublai Khan, dressed in red primarily, which signaled another major feast day. So these were very carefully mapped out over the course of the year in 13 great feasts. Aside from that, I just wanted to show you the gugu that Chabi is shown wearing here, this tall, weird-looking headdress that's strapped onto her head, and a real example preserved from the Yuan dynasty. And to compare that to the henin, or this tall, conical-shaped hat that was so fashionable in Paris and other major cities in Europe during the Middle Ages. Who knows, we may be looking at one of the very earliest examples of a kind of global fashion trend here. Aside from that, we know that Kublai was extremely interested in having his Kessetans, as they were called, the people who were closest to him among his nobility, dress in robes that he gifted them in multiple sets, each set in a different color, and that these all resembled his own robes to be worn for very special occasions. So we see this color coding emerging, I think, as a major feature of Mongol court life, one that was actually carried forward in the Qing period. It didn't last really very effectively in the Ming for very long, but in the Qing it was revitalized. And I think we can see this as well in the images, portraits of the Tog Temur and Koshila, who were descendants of Kublai, along with their wives Budashiri and Babusha in the Great Vajra Bhairava Mandala. These are actual, quite close to life portraits as we understand them from painted versions that exist, where again they're all there's red present here. So that seems to signal a very specific day. And before we take a break, I just wanted to show you that I think this whole notion of color coding for specific feasts, so that the Khan would have this vision of a flood of thousands of people eating with him, all dressed in the same color. It must have just been fabulous. But talk about control, the ability to get people to all appear basically in uniform was just huge. And it probably is an idea that began in the previous Jin period, in the period of the Jurchen reign, when we know, for example, from surviving examples of brocaded tabby woven silk, such as this, dating to the Jin period, that the swan hunt was a very favorite motif to include woven in gold into this tabby weave. So here you see the swan flying through foliage in each of these tear-shaped medallions. Now, according to Anne Wardwell, who did so much work on these early silks and so important from the perspective of textile structure and so on, This green is mentioned in the Jin histories for the annual swan hunt as the appropriate color to wear. And this was an institution, of course, the swan hunt, that was begun by the Liao dynasty before, but they didn't insist that people all wear the same color. In the Jin, they did. And interestingly, all examples of this pattern that have been so far discovered are in green. So I'm going to leave you with this while we take a short 10-minute break, and Jennifer is like insistent on 10 minutes. And when we return, I want to talk to you a little bit more about the Mongols' love of cloth of gold and what that meant for the empire.